Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast To Hell and Back.
Hello.
Episode number 102, just to keep you posted because we just finished 100 a couple weeks ago. And it's good to have any of you here. And I think you know the nature of the podcast is really to try to delve into the adversities that people face in their lives, this sort of hell on earth that we go through, whether it's for a day or a year or for years and years. All different kinds, and to try to discover and model and figure out ways that people survive hell and ways that people climb out of hell, all of which was originally modeled and discussed by Marsha Linehan when she developed DBT. So let me start here. On May or September 20th, 2017, was Hurricane Maria that devastated the island of Puerto Rico. And during that night, our guest of today, Natalia Garcia, who came from Puerto Rico and had family there, but who by that point was living as a graduate student in psychology in Seattle at University of Washington, was worried through the night about her family and whether anybody was really going to be lost or have a lot of destruction. And it so happened that didn't happen to her family members there. But in the morning, when she and her husband went in to wake up her 2-year-old son, who had recently just turned 2 and had a 2-year-old birthday, and it was already unusual that he wasn't up waking them up. So they went in to wake him up, and he had passed away during the night. And it complete surprise. He was not ill. He had no symptoms, no signs of anything. A completely unexplained death in the middle of the night. And so that's what they were left with. And I won't go back into that now because actually 8 months after that, or 8.5 months after that, Natalia courageously came on to this podcast, To Hell and Back, and talked about that experience, what it was like in heart-wrenching terms, and then what it was like to try to recover from that, and what did she do to try to recover from that, and what did the people around her do, and how did she interact with her friends, and with her usual daily life, and with her husband. This was their only child. And she talked for 3 episodes, and those episodes, if you wanted to go back and hear that, were in June of 2018. If you go to my website, charlieswenson.com, they're all archived there. So just go there and you'd find 3 podcasts. And so that was 4.5 years ago that I met with Natalia for those 3 episodes. And now it's 4.5 years later and she's a grown-up. Not that she wasn't a grown-up at the time, but she's no longer a graduate student. She's actually a working human being who's out doing a job, which I'll let her tell you what she's doing. And she's done a lot of things since then. And we have a lot of questions. And Nicole and I, and Natalia herself, has a lot to tell about what this long journey of coping with a severe loss. So we usually on this podcast, we've talked to other people who just lost somebody or who just got diagnosed with something or they're coping with cancer and its treatments. But we have never sat down with somebody and talked about the long journey of like 5 years now of having lost a child, an only child, and what a profound thing that is. And so it's a different perspective. And I think it's going to be beneficial to everybody that copes with loss because everybody copes with loss. Not everybody copes with the loss of a young child. But there isn't a person listening to this podcast that hasn't been coping with some kind of loss of something or someone that is still staying with you. I mean, I have my own. We're not going to waste time by talking about them or anyone else's. Today, we're focusing on Natalia. So I just want to So Nicole and I have sort of had some email exchanges with Natalia leading up to this, but we haven't had much of a conversation yet. So this is really it. And it's going to be a 2-episode conversation this week, and then there'll be another one posted a week from now, a week from when this one's posted. So I want to welcome you, Natalia. I am so touched and pleased that we get a chance to hear an update, a follow-up, and what you've been through and what you've learned and what you have to say to other people about this experience you've had. So thank you for coming onto the podcast again. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll say just that, when you recorded those episodes with Charlie, I was just a listener, but I was so struck by your courage, by your willingness to articulate both the incredible pain and the steps that you took to grapple with that pain. I shared your episodes with friends of mine that were dealing with grief in different ways, and it's still something that comes up in conversation. You really have stood out as just a paragon of willingness to be with the kind of full breadth of your human experience. And it's so remarkable. And so it's a particular honor to get to be here with you today, having just kind of passively benefited from your wisdom all those years ago. So welcome.
Thank you both so much, Charlie and Nicole, for all of that. I feel really honored to be invited back to this podcast, and I've been looking forward to having this conversation with both of you today and hopefully a bit more next week. And just to kind of introduce myself to folks listening, I'm Natalia Garcia. I'm 35 years old, a grown-up, according to Charlie, and I live in Seattle, Washington. As Charlie said, I went to the University of Washington for my graduate degree in clinical psychology. I have since, a lot has happened in 5 years. I have since graduated from there, and I'm now a licensed clinical psychologist at the Seattle VA. I'm still in Seattle, and what else should I say? Yeah, a lot has happened in the last 4.5 years since we spoke. Actually. One of the big things that has happened is we've welcomed 2 more children into our family. So I have a 3.5-year-old Owen and a 7-month-old Mateo. So happy to talk about that and what that all looks like after grief, to welcome 2 more children into our family. And I'll share with you that I was actually pregnant with Owen when we did our first conversation 4.5 years ago, but I was very recently pregnant. And I'll admit to you, Charlie, I was feeling very nauseous, and I actually had a trash can next to me during our entire conversation. And that was my greatest fear, that I would get sick in the middle of that recording, but it didn't happen. So
wow.
But yeah,
adds a whole
Owen
other
is
element.
Technically with us. Yes, a whole other element. But no, I am so honored to be back here today to share what the last 4.5 years have looked like. And I'm happy to give a little bit of a general update. Would that be helpful, Charlie?
Yeah, I think so. I just want to say that this is not a general update, but I got a birth announcement when Owen was born. I think I've gotten Christmas cards in the past, and I've gotten notifications of upcoming walks in honor of Jackson in the past. And I've always just been knocked out, usually knocked into tears, when I receive your cards or your announcements. I'm just about in tears right now. But it knocks me out because you always did them in a way that included Jackson.
Yeah.
Even announcements of new things that were not Jackson. It was like, there's Jackson, and with his name and picture of him. And it was like very touching and moving. As somebody who's raised 2 boys, very much identify with an unimaginable level of loss to have that happen. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. It was very touching for me. But I wonder if you could, give us whatever you consider a general update. I'm sure anything you say is going to be of interest to those of us who've wondered for 4.5 years what has happened to you.
Yeah, and I think, just kind of generally speaking, like all things considered, my husband, Brian, is my husband. My husband and I are somehow doing pretty okay after all of this is like my general update. And what I mean by that is, we're functioning in our lives. That's what I think about. We're both functioning, at work, we're functioning at home, in our relationships, with each other. And like I said, we've been able to welcome 2 more children into our family, which of course was, brought up all kinds of things. But one term that I had used in our earlier episodes is this idea of like complicated joy. So that continues to be something that really resonates for me. So we've experienced all the complicated joy that comes with, bringing life back into our home, the joy being like that. I call it the pitter patter of the home. After Jackson died, it was like the deafening silence was so hard. And so now we have that pitter patter back in that house, that chaos that is joyful and exhausting sometimes, but we have that back. We have gotten that back. It has not replaced Jackson, but we do have that back, and that has felt extremely healing. And it also comes with the ongoing grief that is part of, completing an incomplete family. So, my pregnancy with Owen, less so with Mateo, but certainly with Owen, was joyful, right? A lot of people were so happy for us that we had another baby. And I was too. And it brought up grief. It was not simple anymore. It was complicated. I got a lot of questions. Oh, is this your first baby? How do you answer that? I got that question almost daily towards the end of my pregnancy. Prepping the nursery, right? We prepped the nursery, which was Jackson's old room, now became Owen's room, and the process of getting that together. That's usually kind of a joyful, fun thing you do with your partner. And, that had grief in it. And it's not that it was totally, joyful or totally painful. It just has elements of both. Our birth doula, I hired a birth doula to welcome Owen. And I specifically found someone who had training as a death doula as well, because I believed that she could understand the magnitude of what we were doing. And she was incredibly supportive and the perfect person. So those are examples of the complicated joy that I would say characterizes our lives now. But overall, I would say we have certainly climbed out of hell, in a way that I did not expect was possible. When we first lost Jackson, I was sure that my life was over. Hard stop. And 5 years ago, I don't think anybody could have shown me a picture of my current life, like whipping up pancakes on Saturday morning with the boys, or the giggles in the bathtub in the evening. I don't think anyone could have shown me a picture of that 5 years ago, and I would have believed that it was even remotely possible. So, I would say overall we're enjoying our lives with Owen and Mateo and Stella, our dog, who's truly been with us through this all, and then also missing Jackson every day. And I will say one thing that I have grappled with is I can sometimes feel guilty for feeling so okay after all of this. Like, shouldn't I still be just like keeled over in pain? Shouldn't my life just be in shambles after this kind of a tragedy? And a lot of people will say things like, I can't imagine, or I would have fallen apart completely. I could never be as resilient as you. And that's all meant as a compliment. And I try to take that as a compliment, but at the same time, it's kind of like, like what kind of mother is okay after something like this? And I've grappled with that. And what my husband has always said, which really has helped me with that, is that it's not a betrayal to Jackson for us to be okay. If anything, right, like the betrayal would be that the end of his life meant the end of ours, that would be his legacies, that it destroyed us all forever. So I would say my update is we've climbed out of hell and life is a complicated joy.
Wow, that the language of complicated joy is so evocative, and it really does speak to holding space for all parts of your experience. I wonder if, maybe you could pick a moment in time where we could just zoom in on what it's like for you to be inhabiting that complicated joy, to what's going on in your mind. What are the thoughts and feelings? Because I think a lot of us, certainly me, it's easy to kind of want to push away one or the other. and just keep it simple. I want to be feeling good, or I'm feeling so bad that I can't access good. So what is it like to be kind of negotiating back and forth?
Yeah, that's such a great question. What immediately came to mind for me was actually bringing Mateo home 7 months ago from the hospital. I will just backtrack slightly and say, the big sort of grappling with this was when Owen was born. And by the time Mateo came along, I felt like we've done this before. We know what this complicated joy feels like. But there was this entirely new layer of it, which was witnessing their brotherhood. And I was not fully prepared for how witnessing Owen and Mateo's brotherhood was going to sort of wake me up to something else I lost that I didn't even know I had lost. Because it was always, I lost Jackson. But then I realized I lost Jackson's relationship to his siblings he never got to meet. And that Owen and Mateo never got to meet him, although we try to, keep him alive in many ways in our home. But it was that moment that we brought, an example of this is we brought Mateo home from the hospital to Owen. And sometimes those sibling, first meet greets don't go as well, but this one went so beautifully. And there was so much joy for me in bringing home the baby and how excited Owen was. Can I hold him? Can I hold him? And he wanted to show him all his toys. And we put him on the couch with like a boppy, which is like a pillow around his waist, and placed the baby. And just seeing Owen just completely fall in love with his little brother, which I know doesn't always happen when you bring a baby home, but it did for us, was one of the most joyful memories I have of my entire life. And immediately it was like, and Jackson didn't get to do this. Like that was also there. And it's not that it took away from the joy, it just was alongside that joy. And I wouldn't describe it as like, it ruins the moment. It's a complicated thing. And allowing space for all of that to be part of it has been really helpful as we navigate this.
Thank you.
I'll conjure up for me, and I think this might not feel accurate for you, but a picture of your household of these two boys and being brothers and having these moments in the bathtub and the pancakes and the waking up and the welcoming Mateo home and all of that. And then I think, there's a way in which the way you described this, if like there's a hovering presence of Jackson is there too. As if I was in your living room and I look over and there's you and there's Brian and there's Mateo, there's Owen. And then I look over on the side and there is Jackson sitting there, but not sitting there. But it's the sort of like the residual ghost-like add-on. I mean, I don't want to say something that's especially insensitive or something about this, but I can just imagine, because even when we lose a dog, and we're very attached to our dogs, for, I'd say, years with certain dogs, we're sitting in the living room or watching a television or something, and I look over to the side, and it's almost like I know I'm going to see Addie, who's been gone for years, and yet who we loved. It's sort of like, so I just imagine you must have so many moments where somehow he's right on your consciousness, right on the edge of these things, yes, making joy complicated, yeah, and making everything complicated.
Right. I relate so much to what you're saying, Charlie. And yeah, I would say for the most part, it's not like he's pulling us away from joy. It's like, just he's part of our family. And that's just kind of the framework we've had for this. It feels hard to think of any other way to really think about it. And I know we've been really intentional about keeping him alive, so to speak, right in our home, like you're saying, Charlie. And, we have like photos throughout the house of Jackson. So, Owen has grown up seeing him, as long as he can remember. We talk about him regularly. We celebrate his birthday. We even made like a little board book, board books, like little baby books that are resistant to tearing. We made a board book of Jackson when Owen was born, and now Mateo's playing with it more, that has like what he liked to eat, like what he liked to play, and photos of his family, and like, oh, I have the same family as you. This is my grandma and grandpa, so we've just tried to find ways that he's just always part of the family. And in some ways, having him sort of ever present in that way has actually been helpful, because it's never been like this big, heavy thing that we need to sit down and break the news around. I think I used to always kind of fear, like, gosh, how are we going to explain this to our future kids? Like, what kind of shock is that going to be? But he's just grown up with this. And it's like many gradual conversations based on his growing age and his understanding. And instead of me, I used to worry, like, how am I going to get this right? Like, how am I going to tell him? How am I going to explain it? I focus less now on like making sure I say the right thing and more on just fostering this open dialogue and connection that helps us figure it out over time and just kind of meet him where he's at. Because death is a tricky concept, even for a 3.5-year-old. And so we just like want him to know that anytime he wants to talk about it, we're available. He actually told me the other day, he said, it was very sweet. He said, Mama, Jackson is in the dying place. And I said, oh, what's the dying place? Because we haven't talked about a dying place. And he said, oh, it's over there behind the mountains. And he told me, he's over there with Jack. Jack is my in-laws' family dog that actually passed away about a year ago. So he said Jackson's over there with Jack. And the dinosaurs, because he loves dinosaurs, but he knows they're extinct, which means that they're dead. So I'm not sure where he got this idea, but I just thought it was beautiful. And it's just like his way of processing it at age 3. And we'll have more conversations as we go, and we'll unfold it slowly over time.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
I'm thinking about, as you know, we had a sort of an email exchange with Beth McCrave, who, if people have been listening to the podcast, Beth shared in 2 podcasts in a row about the suicide death of her son Ross at age 24, 2.5 years ago. And she talked about what that's been like for the last 2 to 2.5 years. And she just showed a level also of kind of like a straightforwardness, a courage, a humility, a authentic explanation of what it was like, and then her other son we spent an hour with, and then her other son's fiance, who was a close friend of Ross, we spent. And so Beth has already connected with Natalia in the past, and now a reconnection around knowing this podcast was coming. And one of the things that Beth wrote that I thought was an interesting question had not occurred to me was, and this would be particularly about Owen being old enough to be in whatever daycare or school or preschool he's in, and he's going to encounter other kids, and he has the unusual experience of having a brother who isn't there. And if he talks about that brother and says, no, his brother's in the dying place, or he's dead, I just wonder if you've had experiences or you've had to help Owen deal with anything, or has there just been a way he's handled this that's been kind of natural so that other kids don't like misunderstand him or give him a hard time?
Yeah. And it's that balance, right? Like, I want to make sure that we're talking to Owen about it. And I also want to make sure that I'm like preparing him, kind of like you're saying, for, outside of our household, how do people talk about this? And so far it's just been this incredibly natural thing. And I'm not at school with him, so I don't like witness, these interactions yet, but I'm sure as he gets even older, there, I'm going to hopefully be able to support him more in that kind of thing. I have witnessed a couple. So one was when he turned 2, they do this thing in his Montessori classroom called birthday circle. And we went for birthday circle on his birthday. And we brought the baby along because the baby had just been born. And actually, no, I was very pregnant. But I was pregnant, and we were talking about how Owen was about to have a little brother. That's what it was. And the other kids in the class started to say, oh, the preschoolers, like, I have a brother, like, I have a sister. Like, everybody wants, to talk about their siblings. And then Owen just kind of like said, well, I have 2 brothers. And in that moment, that really struck me, because really physically he had no brothers. He has a dead brother and a brother in utero who he hasn't met yet, but he really clearly had this identity of like, I have 2 brothers. And he didn't say that in like a sad way or anything, just like, oh, I have 2 brothers. Their names are Jackson and Mateo. And,
Wow.
we have these Jackson shirts that we wear for our Jackson flower walks that are blue, and they have a J on it with like a pink flower. And the other day, my husband got him dressed for school because maybe I wouldn't have put him in that shirt for that reason that I'm not sure what people would say about it. But when I went to pick him up at the end of the day, I saw he was wearing that shirt to school. And so I asked him, I said, "Oh, you're wearing your Jackson shirt." I said, "Did anybody ask you about that?" He said, "Yeah, my teachers asked me why I have a J on my shirt." And I was like, "Oh, and what did you say?" And he said, "I told them it's my Jackson shirt." Like, it's just so matter of fact for him,
Right.
So, and he'll say things like, "My brother died." And that's it. So I think for him, it is a very natural thing to talk about. And in our society, it's a very unnatural thing to talk about.
Right.
So I want to kind of support him as he gets older and how to talk about it with people.
I wonder if in our society you find that it's an unnatural thing by this point for you to talk about. Like if you bring it up, or do you hesitate to bring it up because it does feel unnatural, and what are people going to think, or how are they going to respond? I mean, I know stories that you told 4.5 years ago about dealing with the mothers of Jackson's friends who had been to the birthday party, and mothers that you knew very well, and how to deal with them. But what's it like by now? Is it complicated for you to know how to talk about him or whether to talk about him?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind with that is, as you mentioned, Charlie, the Jackson Flower Walk every year. So I sent out a thing about that. In August, we do it every September because September is his birthday, and his death anniversary 10 days later. So September is the month of the flower walk. And as I was crafting that email, I noticed this kind of voice, or like this self-conscious part of myself that was like, "Are we still doing this?" And that voice, I was surprised I had that voice, because that's not actually how I really think and feel about this. I feel very strongly that I can keep doing Jackson flower walks for the rest of my life, and that's wonderful. And I don't want to have judgments about that. But I think that's kind of like what I've internalized of society. I think before I grieved, before I knew what grief was, I think maybe I had those questions about other people. Like, it's been X number of years. Are we still doing this? Or, so I think that's society's expectation. And so I hear that, I've internalized that myself. And then I kind of sit with also, my values around this, which is, grief doesn't go away. Grief is something that just changes over time. And I kind of want to be a spokesperson, or like, PSAs around grief, because I think society has it all wrong. We don't move on. We don't go back to normal. We move forward with the new normal. That's kind of my mantra around that. And I think it's okay that there's always going to be, that empty chair at the table, the pause in the conversation, and frankly, the hole in my heart. And even if somebody told me I can repair that hole in your heart, I would say, no. That is my grief, and I'm on some level, attached to that. I still want to function, I still want to move forward, but like that's where Jackson lives, right? And I think now, 5 years later, it's like there's beautiful things that have grown around the edges of that hole. I'm not trying to paper over the hole, but I'm allowing things to grow out of that. And there are a lot of beautiful things that have grown out of our grief. And that's kind of how I think about it in terms of the passage of time.
If you were to go back in time and talk to an earlier version of yourself that was maybe judging other people and having those thoughts like, okay, are we still talking about this? Like, how might you relate and share with your younger self in a way? I mean, do you think you would be able to communicate in a way that you then could understand? Or do you think it's something that you really do have to go through in order to connect with?
Such a good question. I will say that the people who seem to understand me best are grievers. And in that way, I think it kind of takes knowing this process to understand that it doesn't go away. It just evolves and changes over time. And I'm thinking back to the people who told me that when Jackson first died. were grievers. So I think it does take some level of having experience with this to fully understand it. I remember once hearing that a father who had lost his daughter, he had said, it had been a couple of years or 3 years or 4 years. And he said something like, I still think about her every single day. And I thought to myself, okay, well, not like every day, but like, okay, still think about her. I didn't really understand. And now I get it. And it's not that every day he's sitting in a closet, like unable to function, but it's that she crosses his mind every day. Jackson crosses my mind every day. And I don't know that I would have understood that. But I also hadn't grieved before. I mean, I had grieved some deaths, but nothing quite like this.
I think you must have seen one of these emails from Beth when we were exchanging in the past week, saying that people, now that she is carrying her grief with her, and I think she would probably relate to the way you're talking about this, that she said people would be probably really surprised to hear how many times a day she thinks of her son.
Yeah.
But just over and over again, just here. And I know it because I know her pretty well. And I know there were, almost nowhere did her son not touch. I mean, their yard, the woods, the mountain near them, the climbing, particular television show, a particular book, a particular conversation, it's sort of like he was everywhere. Just as I assume in a certain way, Jackson was everywhere. I mean, it wasn't 24 years like it was for Beth, but it was like 2 years. And already, if I remember raising a 2-year-old, they're everywhere. It's like, so you can't really go somewhere without being reminded. I'm remembering, Natalia, that 8 months later, when you talked on that podcast, you talked about that when you would drive to work, you would pass where you used to drop him off at daycare. And how that was how you had to deal with that. You either had to decide, I'm going to take a different route to daycare, or I'm going to go right past there, and I'm going to be thinking of him when I go by there. And I think you deliberately chose, as you did some other things like that, to go ahead and not avoid it. I wonder if you could say now, because I think that was such an important thing, but that was 8 months of that. Has that been a theme that has affected your life? Is this one of the flowers that's grown around the hole in your heart, is that you've learned not to avoid certain things? Or did that go on in you? Did that continue to develop?
Absolutely. I mean, that's been my mantra in this recovery is the approach lifestyle, because I think early on, like you say, Charlie, it's so true. Like, he was everywhere, but in a way that was like haunting. Right? Everywhere I looked was a trauma trigger, something that I felt I couldn't handle. And it wasn't just all the places he had been and touched and that reminded me of him. It was even things like the elementary school down our street that he never got to go to. So he never even had been there, but he was supposed to go there. Like everything was a reminder of things he had done or never got to do. And everywhere I looked, there was those triggers or those cues. And the process of exposing myself to those in this intentional way helped me reclaim those cues back. So if before, driving by his daycare was a source of just literally just gut wrenching pain, now I'll actually bring it back to the birth of my 2 children. I have to drive by there to get to UW Hospital, where both times I was in labor. And as we passed that intersection, I was like, hey, buddy, and what used to be such a painful intersection is now a touchstone. So that approach lifestyle helps turn trauma cues into touchstones. And that's the benefit of doing the hard work that is exposure.
I'm curious, was there that kind of alchemy by, really kind of entering into the tender spots or, the pain points directly, rather than avoiding, and then really, like you said, reclaiming those relationships with spaces, with thoughts, with ways of being, reclaiming them as your own. Is that something, because I think people can go their entire lives and never experience that or always want it, but just be so afraid. Do you think there was something innate in you that allowed you to do that? Did you, were there earlier experiences that fortified you? Because it's pretty remarkable. I'd love to have a little bit of that.
I think this, goes back to something we talked a little bit about, the ways in which I have felt very privileged in my grief. And one of the ways in which I have felt very privileged in my grief is the education and training that I have, because approaching trauma cues is extremely counterintuitive. Why on earth would we do that? Right? It is painful. And I can't tell you the number of people that I've worked with just in my clinical work who will describe to me their pervasive avoidance patterns as self-care. Yeah. And so I say this because I think what really helped me do this and then kind of like blindly trust the exposure principles is that I have seen them work as a therapist when I do prolonged exposure with a patient who's experienced PTSD or experienced trauma and has subsequently developed PTSD. I've seen the power of exposure firsthand from the seat of the therapist. And then when this happened, it was like, wow, I'm going to have to be as brave as my patients now.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, just to follow up on that, if now from what you've experienced and how you've really, I think, fostered that courage in yourself and created a lifestyle out of it, if you could, maybe is there a seed of wisdom that you could offer clients that are struggling, maybe haven't made it over to the other side? Is there something you've learned from really kind of adapting that so wholeheartedly?
Yeah. I mean, I think, what actually comes to mind. So yes, teaching like approach lifestyle, teaching, the rationale behind why to do exposure, is a big part of what I do. And I think it really comes down to radical acceptance. I don't think we can do much until we have radically accepted a very, very painful thing. And that is sort of the starting point there. And so I think people are not always aware how much they are not accepting a situation. And it takes really talking about radical acceptance for that to click and to get the buy-in and the motivation to accept and to explain what's in it for them to radically accept. Now we can start to do the healing around this, right? But when people are early on in grief or trauma or some sort of significant destabilizing event, I think it's really just the initial steps of radical acceptance, of coming to terms, is like saying it out loud, right? For me, it was like, Jackson died. And saying that over and over, Jackson died. And even if I didn't fully believe it, I think actually Beth McCrae talked about this a little bit, like hearing yourself saying those words to other people and being like, oh, I'm going to call you next week and correct that memo. But just saying the words, Jackson died. And then next, it was like the very specific behaviors of a person who has radically accepted, even if I'm not there yet. So the specific behaviors of somebody who's in radical acceptance are things like removing the car seat from the car. That was a big one. Planning the service. Picking out the urn. Beth also talked about that one. And even if you're not fully radically accepting yet, it's kind of that like fake it till you make it, do the behaviors of somebody who has accepted. But ultimately, what I needed was radical acceptance. And that did not happen overnight. And so I try to talk to people about how that is a process. I think sometimes we talk about radical acceptance as like flipping on a light switch. But it's not been that way for me. And I fall sometimes out of acceptance, and it's turning the mind back to acceptance. And the main thing has been catching myself in the shoulds and the what ifs. And that's the big thing that's changed for me over the course of the last 5 years. I used to get really stuck in those rabbit holes. And now I have learned to see those rabbit holes, right? The what ifs, right? Like, what if I had taken him to the ER that night? Which would have been silly because he didn't even have a fever. He was like 99.5. I mean, just who would have done that. But I thought, what if I had taken him to the ER? I thought, what if we hadn't moved into this new house? We've just moved into a new house 2 weeks before. What if we were still at our townhouse? Would it have happened? I don't know. What if I had kept him home from school that day? What if I had checked on him in the middle of the night? And I would just spend so much time in those rabbit holes. And eventually I had to recognize that those rabbit holes, like nothing productive happens there. Nothing helpful lives there. And it's a very natural thing to do, but it's very unhelpful. And it's basically the mind's way of trying to undo the trauma somehow. It's like, how could this have gone differently? Finding that secret trap door where then it doesn't happen and I can have my son back. And we don't realize we're doing that when we're in a rabbit hole, that's actually why we're doing that, but it is. And so I've learned to step out of the rabbit hole once I find myself in it or kind of poking around the entrance. And I'm like, oh, that's that rabbit hole. I've been there. Nothing helpful lives there. And that awareness and that mindfulness of when I'm stepping in and gently stepping back out. And I think that's what I try to impart when I work with folks in expectations around what radical acceptance looks like and how exposure fits in with that.
Natalia, would it be stepping in a rabbit hole of the kind you're talking about to be asking yourself over and over again, why did this happen?
Mm-hmm.
Is that thought itself, do you think, kind of an avoidance or kind of like being stuck?
Yes.
Because some people that I've worked with get stuck and they'll say, and they might say about sexual abuse when they were a child, why did he do that? How could he have done that? Mm-hmm. And go back and go over and over that. Why did he do it? How could he have done it? What kind of person would do that? It doesn't make sense to me. And it seems to me there's a certain point where it's understandable somebody first asks those questions.
Yes. Yes.
But after a while, it's another version of a rabbit hole. Like it's an understandable question to ask, but I found myself saying sometimes to patients, I can understand you asking that, and you keep asking that, but actually there's no answer.
Right.
And there won't be an answer.
Right.
And by continuing to ask an unanswerable question, there's not going to be new data.
Right.
And so you're kind of keeping yourself stuck. That doesn't mean they can get out of there, but just to name it.
Right.
As that, I wonder, does that make sense to you? If you kept saying to yourself, why did this happen? Or how did this, because I know that you're aware of research going on.
Yeah.
And maybe you could say something about what this was that he had and what kind of work goes on about that, because people might be listening thinking, a 2-year-old? I know I've heard of sudden infant death syndrome, but isn't that younger babies?
Right. And so, absolutely. So we don't know why Jackson died still after all this time. And so technically, it's called SUDC, sudden unexplained death in childhood. Like you said, Charlie, it's kind of like SIDS, but SIDS is for babies who are 0 to 12 months old. So anything from age 1 to 18 is SUDC. And it's when there's no explanation of the death after a thorough investigation, including autopsy. So after autopsy, we signed up for various studies through the SUDC Foundation, who has been fantastic in supporting us through this. They actually have a study where they got blood work from me, blood work from Brian. They looked at our genetics. They looked at blood samples of Jackson's, and they were not able to find any cause of death. And so SUDC is not a thing people die from. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. So what it means is that it's a category of death. So it's not an explanation. It's just, here's the people we don't know why they died. Mm. And to your point, Charlie, when there's like an unanswerable question, that's our experience to a T. Sometimes people have events where there's an explanation. Ours doesn't even have one. And so, yes, getting stuck in like, why did this happen? I've asked myself that 17 million times. And I think it's perfectly normal to ask ourselves that question. And then at a certain point, it's like, okay, how many times have I asked this question? How helpful? What have I arrived at by asking myself this question? And labeling it, like you say, as rumination, as avoidance, as a stuck place, as a rabbit hole. Just there's truly nothing that we could have done differently or known to have done differently. So dropping it. And even when there is something that people find out, right? Like I have an SUDC mom friend who, after she did all those studies, they found a cause of death for their child. And for that child, it was myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. And so they were able to find a reason. But even when there's a reason, like, what could you have done differently? Like, what on earth could you have known about that? Right. And it's this like futile exercise because it's just hindsight bias and it cannot be undone. And so, you know, I go back to, you know, DBT with this, right? It's the difference between pain and suffering. It's like dropping the rope, letting go of that tug of war, struggle against reality that it shouldn't have happened. Like, well, it did happen. And I'm left with the pain, but I let go of the suffering when I drop the rope. And that's a hard thing to do. And I've had to do it many times, but I don't find myself in the rabbit holes as much anymore.
You know, what's so interesting is, you know, you've managed to really keep Jackson so much alive in your life, so present and with you, part of your celebrations. You've honored his memory. And I think without radical acceptance, that, you know, the way you described it, the actions of maybe, you know, keeping his pictures all around your house and discussing him with your boys and all of those things could be maybe seen or understood as resisting or denial or whatever. But because you came so quickly and so fully and went all the way into radical acceptance, and you really did allow that process to fully unfold, it's like you are able to have to do those, maybe those same things that you would have done in resistance in a very different way with a completely different quality of being. And,
Yes.
And I just think it's a really, really interesting, because do you know have you encountered other people that have experienced this kind of grief, with young children that have also managed to engage in this kind of relationship over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, I've actually met a lot of bereaved parents over the last 5 years. Some of them have experienced similar losses, you know, SUDC, others different kinds of losses. But, you know, through our network, when somebody's kid dies, it's like, gotta call Natalia. You know, so I've met a lot of families. And I think, you know, I've seen lots of different ways that this can go. It's always so hard to say exactly, but you know, without judging anyone's process, I do see other families sometimes get really stuck in non-acceptance. And in fact, I think it's harder for them to have, it works out one of two ways. It's either harder for them to have those cues around because it's a cue for like this like shock and bewilderment that hasn't been processed. Or it's kind of what you're saying, I think, which is this like intense longing, intense attachment to like, I've got to be looking at his photo all day. Here's a shrine and like every day we eat dinner and there's pictures of him all over the table. You know, it can go that way too. And it is, again, it's hard to say, you know, what is.
Or the memory gets pushed away altogether.
Right. And it's hard to say, like, for any given family, like, you know, what's effective. I think that's for each person to decide what works for them. But I have seen across that spectrum. And I think for us, like, I can say really confidently that, like, I accept that he died. And I, again, like, and then that brings up, like, what kind of mom am I that I accept that my son died? But no, it's not that, again, acceptance is not liking or approving or wanting. It's, this happened. And I know I'm making it sound really simple, but it's been a lot of going down the rabbit hole. Nothing helpful lives there. Going down the rabbit hole. Nothing helpful lives there. And at this point, I don't go there anymore. I mean, on sensitive days, maybe like on a death anniversary, it kind of comes back. In fact, Puerto Rico had another hurricane on the anniversary of Jackson's death, literally within 24 hours of that. It was extremely eerie. It felt a little bit like I was reliving it. There are times when I kind of fall back in, but for the most part, I don't feel pulled to go there anymore.
What about your husband?
Yeah.
What's his process like about things like this?
It's a good question. We're really on the same page about this. And I know Beth had asked me, has he learned DBT skills through osmosis? And I think he has, in fact, he, I want to say a few months after Jackson died, he described to me, so he was the one that did CPR on Jackson. He was unresponsive. I did not have to do that. So he had some very intense sensory memories that were very hard to shake and would show up as kind of flashbacks for him. And he told me sort of after the fact that he would go on runs often at this time. And one of the times he came back and he said, I went on a run or walk in the woods, and I sat down and I just replayed every detail I could remember, and I said it out loud, and then I did it again. And, in some ways that's kind of like exposure therapy. Usually we do that over the course of several weeks, but just one dose of that. And he said it really helped. And he never would have thought to have done that, except that he knows the work I do and that I've said that helps patients dealing with flashbacks. And he felt he had to do that alone. And he didn't tell me he was going to do that, but he did that. And we went to grief counseling together, and we've been alongside each other through this in a way that we talk really openly about the skills. I mean, he really, he's used the tip scale on election night. He knows DBT skills. And I think that's ultimately, back to your question, Charlie, like, what do we have to offer people who may not have the same resources or privileges that we have? And, I'm so privileged in grief, my training, like I said, we're generally like stable people, lots of positive social support. But the one thing really has been these skills. And that is why I'm so passionate about teaching the skills, because I think that they are accessible. And I think that we can offer those to people no matter what their life looks like. And that's what I mostly credit with our recovery.
I'm thinking of a woman that I treated at one point and I've shared this at some point on some podcast. Now there's been too many podcasts. I can't remember what I've shared where because they overlap with trainings I do and stuff. But it's like this woman came to see me because her son had passed away. He had died, not of suicide, but in a tragic accident. He was only 20 or 21 years old. And it was 2 years later. And when I asked her to tell me what her day was like, she said, well, I get up, and she seemed very cheerful. And I head for the kitchen after I get ready. And I stop by at so-and-so's room, and I open the door and I say, good morning, honey. I said, and do you hear anything back? She said, no, but you never know. And then she closed the door and she said, and then I go make breakfast. I said, do you include him at breakfast? So, oh yeah. Oh, there's always a place at the table. You just never know. So she was living her life that way, and she was getting increasingly depressed and hopeless about life. And yet she wasn't directly connecting these things. And so I guess I want to ask you, as somebody who's been in a not that exact trench, but can imagine, like, what if you imagined that was your way, that you're going back to Jackson's room and saying good morning, or you're leaving the car seat in, or like, what would you say to somebody like that? What would you say?
I would first really assess, kind of back to your question, Nicole, is this something that is effective for this person? Because I definitely early on would say goodnight to Jackson's urn, every night, just, kiss on the urn and goodnight, buddy. I don't do that anymore. And I can't even remember when I stopped doing it. It probably kind of phased out. But I don't think of that as an ineffective thing to do. I think that could work for people, and at different stages of grief, that probably makes more sense, But if I felt so if the person's not functioning in their lives, I keep coming back to the idea of functioning, are they functioning in relationships and their goals, right? For some people that has to do with work or school or self-care, whatever that is, are they also doing the activities of living? And in the research, they talk about the dual process model of grief. And this has been a very helpful concept for me, right? There's like what's it called? I'm now blanking on the term, but it's kind of the reflective kind of processes where you think back on the loss, being in touch with the emotions around the loss. And then there's the restorative side, which is, the activities of living, like engaging in the relationships that you still have in the flesh, doing the things that are needed of you. Maybe you have a new identity or a new role, whatever that looks like. And the idea in the dual process model of grief is that neither is pathological. There's a natural oscillation between these. And the goal is to just kind of become a little more intentional about that. So there might be times where avoidance makes perfect sense. If I'm about to give a big presentation and someone says, hey, tell me about that time Jackson died. I'm like, I can't think about that right now. That's not helpful to me, right? So there are going to be times when avoidance or reflecting, makes sense. And then there's going to be times when diving into the new roles and responsibilities, identities, relationships makes sense. And figuring out what the effective path is oscillating between the two. Neither are good or bad. It's
a very good answer. And it connects with another person we've recently, I don't know if you may not have listened to this podcast, but I did some podcasts, or we did podcasts, or did just I think maybe with Andrea Gold.
That was just you, yeah.
It was just me, but dealing with being diagnosed with cancer right as she was saying goodbye to her mentor, Seth Axelrod, who died of cancer. And so she talks about the importance of suffering, getting into suffering and allow yourself to suffer and allow yourself to cry, and having people around you not shut that down. Yes. And really owning the privilege of suffering, or the need to suffer, or the mechanics of suffering, the whole thing. Do that. Don't avoid that. And at the same time, and even on the same day, because she also has young children like you, take them to the zoo.
Yes.
And notice the smiles on their faces and how much fun it is. And let yourself take joy. Mm-hmm. And on the same day that you've been deep diving into being worried about your life and the suffering you go through. It's sort of, I'm getting the same idea from you, that it's like a dual processing model of dealing with cancer. Right. There. It's like, yes, let yourself cry. Let yourself feel it. Let yourself express it. Be careful not to have people shut you down when you're talking about that, or to stigmatize you or invalidate you. And then at the same time, make sure that you do things that bring you some sort of sense of meaning or purpose or joy, exactly. Over and over. And that sometimes has to be done deliberately, because for some people, the tendency when you're in these situations is, no, I'm sorry, joy is out the window. No, I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to go do things that I know all my life have made me feel better. I'm just not going to do them. Right. And then you get stuck.
We've spoken about with Beth, and the self-judgment, or this idea of expectations of, when you're allowed to feel better, or when you're allowed to grieve, and when you're supposed to feel better, or what's normal. So, you're talking about, not being pathological in either direction, but I'm curious about, how you manage to be in an open, non-judgmental space with yourself and really modulate it. Where am I at right now? Where do I need to, because we can't, we all love to control whether or not people give us the space that we need, but sometimes that's not possible. And the hardest thing can be really just giving ourselves the permission to feel how we feel, whether or not it's appropriate or convenient or any of those things. And I think that what you're saying, having that space to kind of go back and forth, or Charlie, like you said, to really go into the depths of pain, and then to, take your kids to the zoo, kind of depends on the ability to allow yourself to really go there, rather than, prematurely pull yourself back and tell yourself to get it together because, it's not okay. So I'm just really curious how you really allowed yourself to just be where you were as you were there, and then include the ebbs and flows as that naturally evolved.
Yeah. my mind is going so many places with this question. It's a very good one. I think I'm just going to come back to kind of dialectics too, where it's so important to be with what is coming up for you. And there's some importance in structuring activities so you don't fall into the depths of despair. Like, I think like we're kind of highlighting both of these things are important. And, just because recently we had the death anniversary just last month, I was feeling, you would think as a mother who lost their son, there's nothing more I'd want to do on the anniversary of my child's death than to just hold my babies close. And what I was really longing for and needing was a little bit of space away from my children to sit on the couch and listen to music that reminds me of my son and just cry and have the space, like have the permission to just feel those feelings. So I asked my mom to take the kids, and Brian and I sat on the couch and we gave ourselves an opportunity to cry. And I love a good cry. I know that sounds wild, but to me, that is so, so helpful. But I'm not forcing myself to cry. It's just giving myself space to feel those feelings that is difficult when I'm changing diapers and grabbing food. And, it kind of is like a mood kill to be doing the parenting activities when I just kind of want to sit with those feelings. And so I asked for protected space to sit down and listen to music and just be. And what I expected would happen is what happened, which is that I cried. I didn't force myself to cry, but that is what happened. And that felt really good. And I also knew that I wanted to not sit on the couch and cry all day that day. And so we did the equivalent of going to the zoo. It's actually funny you say the zoo. That's often a thing we do because we have a zoo tile in memory of Jackson at the zoo, and we often visit that. On this particular day, it wasn't the zoo, but we did kindness acts, which is part of Jackson's ongoing kindness project, one of our kind of meaning-making roses that grows around the hole, right, that we were talking about before. And what we did was something kind of age-appropriate for Owen that he expressed interest in. We found some of Jackson's old baby books and toddler books, and we picked out, we have so many books, and we picked out, like 20 of them or so that we were willing to part with. And we taped little Jackson kindness cards to them and went around the neighborhood, and those like free libraries that people have outside their homes, like little book libraries. And we found a route, and we hit up like, I think 7 or 8 of them, and we like dropped off the books and opened them and put them in. So we came up with something to do other than cry that day. That was meaningful, like to your point, Nicole, like something that has meaning. And that felt also so soothing. Like I got so much out of both of those activities. And I try to approach my grief with that kind of balance. And it's not clear cut, like you need 40% of this and 60% of that. I mean, again, each to their own, but I check in with myself, like trying to find what that balance feels like. And sometimes it involves meeting myself where I am, and sometimes it involves pushing myself to do a structured activity. And I think both can be helpful.
This might be like a really banal question, but I think it might be helpful for listeners as you're talking about checking in with yourself, and really, it sounds like you're very, very in tune with what you need and when you need it. And, what is it like in the moment? Or, can you articulate or illustrate what that tuning in process is for you? How do you kind of sense into, okay, this is a space from my kids cry on the couch moment versus, all right, I really want to make sure I've got some structure in place here. Like, how are you in conversation with yourself in a way that allows that to be a lifestyle? And how, were you always there? Did you get there?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. It's actually causing me to reflect a little bit on this, and I hadn't really thought about it before. When Jackson first died, I did not trust my wise mind. I was completely thrown. And I remember conversations with my supervisors, Catherine Patrick and Sherry Manning at the time, also Melanie Harned, talking to them like, what am I supposed to do? And the specific question was like coming back to work and seeing patients. And I was like, how do I know when I'm ready to do that? And they were like, I think you're going to know. I was like, but I don't know. And I looked externally a lot, when Jackson died, I went to PubMed to find out how long grief lasts. That's how silly that, I was so not confident in my ability to do this. And I looked to other people, to the literature, to the experts, to tell me how long was this terrible thing going to last? And what am I supposed to do to get through it? And I think in answer to your question, it's been 5 years and I've developed this attunement to my wise mind that I always had, but didn't quite trust or listen to or know how to access. And yeah, I guess I don't have like a better answer to that, but I've had a lot of experiences that have helped me develop that confidence in what I need. And I didn't have it right away.
That's really helpful.
Well,
thank you for sharing that.
That's really helpful. Very interesting. Wow. Natalia and Nicole, we're going to stop. And I know you may let go, radically accept the end of the podcast. There's different levels of grief, and
too true.
This brings up so much about grief that beyond this particular version of grief. I was just sitting here grieving certain ages that my children went through and what it was like at those ages. And because it's never that way again. And it keeps changing. So I was realizing, I'm learning things, having you talk just about, I'm going to have to radically accept some of these things, let some of these things go, realize there are cues for this, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm hoping that other people listening are taking away this. This is not just sort of like, isn't this an amazing curiosity that what Natalia did? It's not that. It's like, this is a human process that people grieve as part of recovering from traumatic experiences in life and grief. And so it's just very helpful. So we're going to go on into it more. And next week, we're going to do another podcast. Gosh, I just want to ask, as I always do at the end of these podcasts, it would be great to get any feedback. That can be done through comments wherever you listen to this podcast. It can be done through going to my website and writing me an email. I get some that way, and any other way you can get to me or Nicole and give us input about this, including other questions you have about it and what it brings up for you. And, and if you're in a location where you can rate and review the podcast, that always helps.
It's the way other people find the podcast. So it's really, really important. And and if you subscribe, it also, you'll be sure that you get next week's episode as well. Right. But rating and review, it's really, really important. It helps us a lot.
So thanks, Natalia. Thanks, Nicole. That's good
Charlie,
to
thanks for telling me.
have this conversation. We'll continue it next week.
Thank you both. See you then.
Okay.
Bye.